So this afternoon, we're going to be thinking about how we can use talk for developing science understanding. And I would like you just to start straight away by sharing your ideas as to why do you think it's important that we give time for the children to talk? Thank you, Michelle. So increasing children's vocabulary, that's a key thing, which we will talk about later. They need to hear the vocabulary. They need to use that vocabulary. Getting them to share ideas. Sharing ideas is such an important part of making sense of things, which is exactly what's just been posted there. So actually, whilst talking, we reformulate our ideas, we listen to other people who may have a slightly different opinion, and then we have to decide, are we going with their idea, are we sticking with ours, are we able to mold the two together? It's a great opportunity for those children that don't like writing. They can still show us that they understand things by talking, and that's absolutely fine. Giving them more time to actually give their reasons. They won't necessarily have time to write all that down, but to give their reasons, listen to other people's reasons and their opinions. So that's really important. And yes, it's another way of them showing their understanding. So I think it's really important for two aspects that are coming through there. It's that helping them to make sense of things, helping it to stick. The more times we talk about it, the more likely we are to remember it. But also from a teaching's perspective, it's just another window into their thinking, which can help us with our assessment. So there's lots of reasons why talk is important. And we just need to make sure that we build that into our lessons. So we think about, when are we going to give the children time for talk? And actually we plan for it. We don't just expect it to happen spontaneously. So the national curriculum does talk about the importance of science language, the spoken language. The national curriculum for science reflects the importance of spoken language in pupils' development across the whole curriculum. Cognitively, so that's what you're talking about as far as making sure they understand things. It helps it get into their brains. It helps them make sense of things. It's also good for them socially to be talking to each other and explaining things. Being able to communicate your science is so crucial. And that's something that scientists also have to think about. How are they communicating what they find out with the broader world or the rest of the science community? And then also developing them linguistically. So it may be science vocabulary in particular, or it may just be encouraging them to use a wider range of everyday vocabulary, but within that science context. So the science language is really important, and it's really important that the children hear that vocabulary. So they hear it modeled to them by the teachers and the adults. They hear it being used by other pupils, and most crucially, they actually use that vocabulary themselves. They actually speak those words, and that will help them to really refine the way they're explaining things, making sure they are using that vocabulary really precisely. And then finally, we've already talked about this, it helps them to make that thinking clear. So their thinking becomes clearer, but they can also then convey that to other people. And that's really important, so that teachers, so this is where the assessment comes back in, so that you as teachers are really sure, are they thinking what they need to be thinking? Are there some misconceptions in there that we can need to probe a little bit further, and then give them the opportunity to experience something that will help them change their misconception and alter their thinking, and then re-embed that new thinking? And the best way of doing that is through talking with each other, listening to the teacher. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to put you into a situation that may be slightly outside your usual comfort zone, because I want you to start thinking about how talk helps children to make sense of things. Our talk is not going to be verbal. It's going to have to be via the chat this afternoon. So it's not the way we would normally talk, but please do use the chat to post your ideas, look at what other people are posting, and respond to that as well, so we can sort of start to feel like we're getting a little bit of a dialogue. But firstly, I'd just like you to type on the chat what links these images. Okay, so we started with electricity, we've then got static electricity. Let's pause there. So static electricity, that's what links those four images together. This is not something that we would be teaching in the primary curriculum. So I would just like you to think about, on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident, if I were to, and I'm not going to, but if I were to unmute you at this point of time and ask you to explain the concept of static electricity, how confident would you be on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not at all confident and 10 being totally confident? Unmute me now, I'll go for it. Okay, so we've got somewhere between 3 and 5. So I'm hoping by the end of this session, through a combination of me modeling and demonstrating using the language, and then with you having an opportunity to chat and share, your confidence may go up. So firstly, I'd like you to think about, what do you already know about static electricity? This is what we want the children to do at the beginning of a topic. Part of developing their science capital is helping them to realize that they already know stuff. They have stuff that they know from their everyday lives. So think about, what do you know about static electricity from personal experiences? When do you experience it? Where do you experience it? So just share some of your experiences of static electricity. So it makes your hair stick up. Any particular times that it makes your hair stick up? What are you doing when your hair suddenly sticks up? Brushing it, okay? So that's important. So when you're brushing your hair, it sticks up. Touching the carpet and an object at the same time. Can you remember, what sort of object was it that you were touching? Were you standing still on the carpet? Had you been moving? Okay, so if you're wearing slippers and you're sliding around, so yes, there is this idea of moving. When something is moving, you tend to get the static electricity. Climbing out of a car is a classic one, probably because we're scraping our bottoms off the chair and then touching the door. So friction has now been introduced as something to do with it. Okay, so you can see there that you've all got experiences, whether you can remember what you learned at school about static electricity or not. It is a concept that's familiar to you. And that's what we want to do. We want to make sure that we value those personal experiences. And so we personalize and also localize. Are there any particular shops that you go in, perhaps, where this happens? I remember when I grew up, it was the Cliss Pavilion, where we'd go for concerts and go to the theatre. And when you walked up the stairs there, that was particularly bad. My daughter, when I asked her, it was in the primary classroom. She's now 18, but she remembers from the primary classroom, the carpet in there was particularly bad at static electricity. So we've got those personal experiences. We need to value them, giving the children time to talk about those. And then I'll just do a very quick demonstration. Nobody mentioned the balloon. I'll just stop sharing my screen so that you can see me a little bit more clearly. Okay, so I've got my balloon and I could be rubbing it on a jumper or anything else. I'm just going to rub it on my hair. Need to take my headphones off as well. Difficult to know what you were seeing there. Because it's quite hot, a lot of the hair is just sticking to my head today. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Okay, so that was my quick demonstration of static electricity. So even if you had known nothing before, you'd probably go, oh yeah, I do remember that. And that's often the experience that the children will remember as well. And now I want to move into the science aspect of it. So would anybody like to type on the chat what that is? Okay, thank you, Karen. It is in fact an atom. And now some people may be going, oh, where's Naomi going with this? Okay, I am going to ask you, it is an atom. And I'm going to ask you to have a little look at this. And I want you to think about which labels you can add to the diagram think about how you know. Is it something you've just remembered from your school days, or is it something that you can work out by a process of deduction, maybe looking at any clues that you can see in the image, or thinking about the root stems of some of those words? So have a go at thinking about, can you name all of that, and how? Are you just relying on memory, or are there other clues? Thank you, do keep typing. So the nucleus is the center, question mark. Why would you think that? Why did you think the nucleus would be the center? Karen, would you like to add a little bit more? What prompted you to think that? And I like Karen also, yes, the positive has a plus sign. So we could definitely say that the positive charge is where that plus is. Neutrons have no charge. So the chances are you're thinking, why is that? Because the neutron is neutral, and so we know that that's no charge. Yes, thank you, Karen. The nucleus is often at the center of something. Think about the nuclear family. So protons have a positive charge. Is there some way that you worked that out, or is that something you've just remembered, Kat? Don't know if you'd like to fill us in on that. And then, sorry, Kate. And electrons around the edge with a negative charge. What's made you think that? Or is that something you've just remembered, Alison? That's interesting, Kate. Pro is good. Therefore, we're saying positive, good. I don't know whether that's got anything to do with it or not, but that would certainly be a really good way of remembering it if we needed to think about it and we needed to remember it for later. So who was I asking about the negative electrons? Alison. Electrons in electricity and negative. So there's a little bit of a combination of using that sort of STEM elect bit, thinking about what do I know about that? It's something to do with electricity, and then dredging your brain possibly for things that you know about that. Yes, some sort of recollection from school. Okay, so I think between us, we've actually grasped all of it. Even though perhaps on your own you wouldn't have been able to do this. And in an ideal world, this would be you working together. So one person would come up with an idea, people would go, yeah, that sounds good. The nucleus probably is in the middle. So you'd confirm that with each other. And then you'd start to hypothesize about some of these other things. So you can see that that works in a very different way face to face. But actually, I think we've done a pretty good job on the chat there of working together. So just very quickly to, sorry, I just got distracted. My chat just moved. So the atom is the whole thing. I think I'm just summarizing for you now. So the atom is that whole thing. The nucleus is the part in the middle there. And one thing that you need to know is that anything, the part in the middle there is what always stays there. Nothing can be taken or added to that. So the nucleus is set. We've got the no charge bit there, which is the neutron, which is what you identified. There's no plus or minus on it, so we can assume that that's the no charge. And then we've got the negative charge, which is the electrons. And it helps us that is the only part that can be removed from the atom, or we can add more to the atom. So that's the flow of electrons is what electricity is. And we'll come back to in a minute how that relates to static electricity. And then we've got the positive charge, the protons. So you did it all. You did it all. Between us, we managed. So now I want to talk about how static electricity is actually formed. And this would be the standard way that it's done at a secondary school, where you have something like a polythene rod and you've got a dry cloth, quite often a duster, and you rub the two together. And it's that friction, as you were talking about, that causes friction. And what's actually happening is some of those electrons are being moved from one surface to the other. And you can see here that the electrons are moving from the cloth, which means there's a surplus of positives left there, and they're moving to the polythene rod, so therefore that becomes negatively charged. When you've got a positive and a negative charge together, they will attract each other, and that's what was happening with the balloon, that the balloon was rubbing my hair and electrons were moving. Don't know which way they're going, I'll be honest, but let's just say the electrons are moving from my hair to the balloon. Therefore, the balloon becomes positively charged and my hair becomes negatively charged, and they are then attracted to each other. So that's how static electricity is created. So I'd just like you to just reflect and comment at this point in time. How are you now feeling? If I were to ask you to explain the concept of static electricity, are you feeling a little bit more confident? Or are you the same? So again, could you just post that onto the chat for me? Okay, those look more confident now. And thank you, Michelle. I think that's important, that it's the images definitely help, having the demonstration, and hopefully I've started to model the type of language that you would be using. So you're feeling more confident, and it's a combination of the images, the demonstration, and the chat that have helped with that, I expect. So I'm just going to ask you to do a very artificial exercise of explaining this to yourself. So I want you to actually explain to yourself out loud, though. Don't think it through. I actually want you to say it out loud. And let's hope you're all muted at this point so we don't hear everybody muttering to themselves. But actually explain out loud to yourself, how is it that the rod and the cloth became charged? And I'll put it back to the image for that. How did the balloon become charged, and what did that do when it was in contact with my hair? And then also think about what happens if I were to rub two balloons on my head. So I rub two balloons on my head, and then I were to bring them together like this. What would you think might happen? So I'm just going to leave you with 1 minute to talk to yourself. So you might want to explain it again, just to see if you can do it better second time round than you did first time round. Okay, end of that painful bit where I hope some of you were talking to yourselves and explaining it to yourselves. What I'd like you to post on the chat is particularly that last part. What did you think would happen if I rubbed two balloons and brought them near together? What did you think about that? And also, if you'd like to just share with us how you got on with explaining, that would be lovely too. Okay, thank you, Kate. I think it is good to give the children time to explain it more than once, because you do get better at explaining it and you don't feel under pressure to make sure I get it right first time. So then, yeah, more fluent the second time round. Practice makes perfect. I think that's exactly. Do we give the children enough time to practice, or do we expect them just to go straight into it? Do we give them time to think about it before we even ask them to speak? In the same way that I might potentially ask somebody if they would like to explain it in a moment, but I'm not just going to unmute somebody and ask somebody to start speaking. I would want to make sure that you feel confident first. And then I'm just going back to what we would think would happen if we had two balloons. They would move apart like two negative poles on a magnet. I think that sums it up really well. If I rub two balloons, then they would both be becoming negatively charged. And we know, thinking about the poles, they're not negative poles. We've got the North Pole and the South Pole, but we know that if we put two North Poles together, they would move apart. And if we put the North and the South together, they would attract. Would anybody like to add in another word at this point? Add another word to Karen's explanation. They would move apart. Okay, repel, thank you very much. So what we're doing there is we're using subject knowledge that we've gained in a different context in electricity, in magnetism, and applying it to this new situation, and actually applying it totally right. So we are talking about attraction and repulsion in the same way that we are from between magnets and the poles. So that's good. So what I'd now like you to just have a think about, I'm not going to do the demonstration because the static electricity at the moment is not great, and I don't think it'll work. But actually, if you can generate lots of static electricity, and unfortunately it is weather dependent, when you hold two balloons, and so long as you've got the rubbed sides together, they will actually repel each other, and you can see that happening. So I would just like you to think about, how confident are you feeling now? You've had a go. Is anybody feeling confident that you'd actually like to unmute yourselves and give it a go? If you do, type on the chat your name and you can unmute yourself and give us that explanation. If not, just type your number from 1 to 10, and I'm not going to pick on anybody, so don't worry. So we've gone up to 8, possibly a 9, but that is certainly a lot higher than where you started. I don't think anybody was going to put 10 on there just in case I suddenly unmuted you and asked you to explain, so I totally get that. But I think hopefully you are feeling more confident. And I think confidence is such an important thing with children, especially if we're going to then ask them to write. How many times do we just tell them something, expect them to write it without them giving them this time to think it through, talk it through before they start writing? So key vocabulary was another important aspect. So how can we support that key vocabulary? There's a number of bits of vocabulary that I've shared with you today. We've got protons, we've got neutrons, electrons, all that sort of thing. So it might be that you just play word games regularly with the children. So taking the vocabulary from a topic and playing word games like bingo, where you read a definition and the children, if they've got that word on the card, they can put a counter on it or cross it off. Word splat, where you might have a group of children and they have to touch that word as quickly as they can, and the child that touches it first wins a point. Or taboo, where you give a definition and they have to identify the word, but you're not allowed to say the word, obviously. Those sort of games, initially probably playing them as a whole class, so you as a teacher would be given the definitions, but once the children become really familiar with that vocabulary and they've heard that definition a number of times, then they can play those games in small groups with different children taking that role of giving the definitions. Another thing that you might possibly do is asking the children to compile glossaries. That could be in their books, or it could be a verbal glossary that's recorded, or it could be some schools have lab coats the children wear, which are just basically old white t-shirts that they've got from home. And a different area of the t-shirt is for a different topic, and the children write that key vocabulary on the sleeve with a definition there. So somehow it just feels better to write it on a shirt than it does on a piece of paper. Having colour pens, having smelly pens, anything that makes the children feel more comfortable writing is really nice. So I just like to think, are there any other strategies that you use to reinforce that vocabulary, be it science or other topics as well? Please do share your ideas on how we can reinforce vocabulary more regularly. So Kate, is that doing sort of closed procedures? Is that what you mean there? Yeah, so who am I, what am I, headbands, so you can actually either stick it on their forehead like a post-it note, 20 questions. Thank you, Kate. Using role play, that's really important. Getting the children to act as reporters, and actually we'll just come on to that in just a moment. Different ways that we can get them to rehearse that talk. Yeah, using sentence starters is important, particularly when we want to start using that vocabulary within larger pieces of talk. "20 questions" is a nice one. You know, which word am I? You can ask questions, but I can only say yes or no. But also using 20 questions to get the children to generate questions is really nice as well. Okay, so the things that Karen's been posting there actually just lead me into this final slide that I've got here, which is that the language that we use when we're talking to each other is often quite informal, and we need to move the children between the informal language that we use in our everyday lives when we're talking to somebody and the more formal language and vocabulary that we would expect them to be using if they're writing it down in particular. It's also the difference between playing in the playground and going to a job interview, being in the pub with your friends, being at a job interview. So we've got these different levels of language that as adults we naturally switch between them, whereas with children we have to support them with moving from informal to formal language. And so one of the ways of doing this is asking the children to talk as an expert, but this is much more in a planned way. So it's rehearsed talk. So possibly it might be, for instance, in this situation that we ask two children to have an interview where there is somebody interviewing the balloon about the experience. So to be able to do that, you can do it as an improvisation, but then often it's good then to get the children to work together and actually plan what questions would the interviewer ask and what sort of responses would the balloon give. We don't write it all down, but we've planned it so that therefore we can actually concentrate much more on thinking about our responses rather than being surprised by the question. Possibly doing a TV news report into a new area perhaps where suddenly everybody's complaining that there's all this static electricity. So as part of that news report, there would be an explanation of what static electricity is. So I'd just like you to think about and share on the chat any other ways that you have asked the children or given the children opportunities to do that sort of more rehearsed talk where they're using more formal language and talking as an expert. Thank you, Kate. I think that radio public announcement thing really means they're focusing on what they're saying and they're not getting distracted by other things. Whereas something like News Round, they're also possibly that idea of videoing. So we're adding another layer in, but they're both good. Presenting their findings to the class. They don't necessarily need to present to the whole class, just having somebody to present to that's going to be an audience for them to listen to. So presenting their work is nice. Presenting their findings also, the Great Science Share is a lovely way of doing that. Obviously it was actually last week and it was an online version, but having that idea of children doing some sort of inquiry, asking and answering their own questions, and then providing a genuine audience, whether that's other members of the class, other members of the school, parents or the local community, so that actually they can then talk and explain. And what the children tend to find with that is the first explanation, when the first people come round, they do a little bit of a slightly shaky version, but once they've done it a number of times, they get into their routine, they get into their patter, and they become really good at explaining something. So providing those opportunities is really good. Okay, so thank you very much. If you are still posting some ideas, please do so. But that's the end of the session for today. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon and responding so well on the chat. I know it's not the same as being able to talk to each other, but hopefully that gave you a little bit of a feeling as to why talk is so important, as far as helping to clarify ideas, sharing your thoughts, and also developing your confidence. Thank you very much. Goodbye.